It was a phrase coined by Winston Churchill in 1946. But 71 years later, is there really a special relationship between America and Britain? And if there is, how does a president promoting far-right videos and questioning the British Prime Minister on the Twitter affect it? This is now a very 21st century diplomatic conflict, with British government ministers taking to social media to attack Donald Trump and the president responding in kind. Today, Theresa May resisted calls to cancel a state visit to Britain planned for Mr. Trump and, choosing her words carefully, said that the president's retweets yesterday of Britain First material was wrong. But can the UK really do anything to stay close to the world's economic and political superpower? And should it want to stay so close, whatever emanates from the White House? Here's our political editor, Nick Mott.
Three very different prime ministers, but they all had one memorable moment in common. Each had a run-in with a US president, and yes, that did include the Iron Lady. Has Theresa May joined the ranks of those past number 10 troublemakers following her very public disagreement with Donald Trump?
President Trump igniting a firestorm, a series of tweets today.
What is happening here, and what do you think the consequences are?
Over here, there was powerful condemnation of the president in Parliament.
It is offensive to all decent British people.
Donald Trump is now actively sowing seeds of hatred in our country.
The President of the United States, who loves Twitter and talks about fake news, actually retweeted fake news.
In Jordan, Theresa May made no secret of her irritation.
Britain First is a hateful organisation. It seeks to spread division and mistrust among our communities. I'm very clear that retweeting from Britain First was the wrong thing to do.
Attention!
This row is all a far cry from the warm days of Theresa May's first visit to the White House, when she followed the rulebook of recent predecessors who've hugged US presidents close. This Prime Minister moved at particular speed because she had hoped to harness President Trump's enthusiasm for Brexit to accelerate a new trade deal with the US.
That new era in the Anglo-American special relationship was meant to begin here, with the opening of the new US Embassy by the River Thames. And who was meant to perform the opening ceremony? Well, that would be Donald Trump. But his visit across the pond is being delayed and delayed and delayed. This might all seem surprisingly bumpy, but we've been here before. The building that this one is replacing over the Thames in Grosvenor Square came to symbolise one of the most difficult periods in that relationship in the 1960s.
Tempers flared at the height of the Vietnam War, even though Harold Wilson had refused a request by President Johnson to send troops.
At the height of the Suez Canal crisis,
a decade earlier, Anthony Eden had incurred the wrath of Washington during the Suez Crisis. And then there was Margaret Thatcher, who did occasionally stand up to Ronald Reagan in private. So how has Theresa May handled her own row?
I'll give anybody credit for speaking up when it's required. And I think good for her for doing that. You know, I'm going to be careful about not criticizing my president and favoring another over him, but you know, I think I say good for her. I wish more Republicans in America would stand up against a tweet like that from the president.
I wouldn't expect the Prime Minister to respond in the kind of chaotic Twitter way that the President of the United States has attacked her. I think that would be completely inappropriate. But I would expect her to have an extremely firm behind-the-scenes response, because this is completely unacceptable from the President of what should be our greatest ally. And he also, I think, needs to be urged to take the tweets down and also to understand why it is so damaging to be promoting a far-right extremist group like that. And I am concerned that really there hasn't been a clear sense from the government about what action they have taken with the White House on this.
Battered and bruised, or living to fight another day? Where does this row leave the special relationship?
I certainly think it's bigger than any one day or any one fight. It's endured through however many presidents and prime ministers on both sides, and I think it still will. I mean, it's really built in our connections with each other as people and as countries and the values that we share. And those are things that are a lot stronger than anyone spat.
Over so very many years, our two countries together have stood firm against both far-right extremism and jihadi extremism, and will continue to do so. But we have to continue that special relationship through our institutions, through our cooperation, and not think it means actually pandering at the individual level to a president who is behaving in a way that is really damaging to our communities.
With its commanding views over London, the new US Embassy should be the perfect base to usher in a new era in the Anglo-American special relationship. But first of all, those riverside diplomats may have to work on a basic repair job.
Nick Watt there. And this story is unsurprisingly dominating most of the papers tomorrow. A couple here for you. The Telegraph has a story which Nick mentioned in his piece there. They're reporting that Donald Trump's working visit in January has been cancelled. It says the president had been due to make a scaled-down trip to meet Theresa May, but that it's now been kicked into the longer grass. The Mirror has a striking front page, a full-page banner with an image of Mr. Trump. Unwanted is their headline. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is with us. Mark, it's quite remarkable, isn't it? You've been covering diplomatic spats and rows and conflicts over many years. Now this row over 240 characters on Twitter. Have you ever seen anything like this? And what is the challenge for the British government when they're looking at how the president is behaving?
Well, I mean, you could argue, if you're being Machiavellian, that sometimes a bit of friction is quite useful. I mean, a lot of people in the Foreign Office, when you're covering a prime ministerial visit to the White House, they literally roll their eyes when the press starts asking questions about the special relationship. They regard it as a media obsession. And, you know, a lot of the debate ends up about the sophistry between a special relationship, which is what you said in your intro, and the special relationship, which of course was the phrase Churchill used. Everybody, I think, would recognise it's still a special relationship, the connections of the Anglosphere, the common economic values, all of those sort of things still make it that. But it's not the special relationship in the way it was, you know, back at the end of the war. I think the real bastions of it still are in areas where the partnership does things that nobody else can do with the UK and for the UK. GCHQ, signals intelligence, the nuclear submarine business, the Trident missile system and its replacement, and special forces. I mean, those are the areas where it still, you know, has a real sort of beating heart and is really intimate, the cooperation. But in so many others, this type of thing can actually be helpful in undermining the sort of poodle perception, which of course people were so worried about under Tony Blair in the noughties.
Absolutely, but is there actually more diplomatic risk? Do you feel that Donald Trump is really cool to Britain and actually is signalling his sort of anger almost about Theresa May and the way Britain behaves on certain issues? Is this simply sort of badinage and sort of doesn't really matter much, or is there something more significant underlying it?
Well, I think, yes, he's showing irritation in the sense he's trying to say to the Prime Minister, don't school me, you know, focus on your problem as he would see it of Islamic militancy, rather than having a go at me. So yes, in that sense, I think it is a bad-tempered, early morning, typical Trump tweet. But I mean, you know, I can remember when President Obama came in and the feeling was, because of his memoir about his father, the experiences in Kenya, that he had a really pretty ambivalent attitude to Britain and British power, and that, you know, he was going to be a really difficult customer. I think compared to him in some ways, President Trump's instincts are more instinctively pro-British, but you know, in terms of it being a special relationship rather than the special relationship, you know, the Americans do regard the Germans as, in many respects, economic and political partners of choice in European matters. The French, in many of those military situations that, you know, I was talking about, for example, special forces cooperating in Mali, the Sahel, Iraq and Syria, there's been a lot going on. Our special forces are a little uneasy about the degree to which those relationships are being cemented, because frankly, ever since Britain bailed early in southern Iraq, the American military has had a more ambivalent attitude to the UK.
Mark, and of course, Donald Trump has been to both France and Germany and yet to come to Britain.
Indeed, the Bastille Day parade with President Macron.
Mark, thank you very much. Joining me now in the studio is Baroness Neville Jones. She was appointed by David Cameron to be his Minister of State for Security and Counter-Terrorism in 2010. Baroness Neville Jones was also Security Minister from 2010 to 2011, when Theresa May was Home Secretary. And in Washington, D.C., we are joined by Mika Mushbacher, who is a Republican strategist and was a national surrogate for the Trump presidential campaign. So, Baroness Neville Jones, could we start with you? Do you feel that Theresa May has handled this situation well? Should she have been more direct? Sajid Javid, of course, the Community Secretary, was very clear about what he described Britain First as being a vile, hate-filled, racist organisation, very aggressive about Donald Trump. Theresa May much more careful with her words. Do you think that that was the right approach?
I think she was right to be. I mean, she is Prime Minister. I think Sajid Javid made the point, he's after, this kind of comment is after people like me. Now, that's not what the Prime Minister, I think, should be concerned about. I think she made her point extremely well, effectively, and I think as far as she's concerned, and I would certainly advise her, that's an end of it as far as she's concerned. I don't think she should then engage in a slanging match or demean herself, by having a further round of unpleasant exchange. There's too much at stake, apart from anything else. And I think that what we witness with Trump is that part of his reaction has to do with the fact that this kind of tweet and this kind of comment has to do with sustaining his political base at home. I don't think it has much to do with foreign policy at all. I don't think actually he particularly cares about the effect in the outside world. And that's not a luxury that's open to us here. But I think that it's another reason for, in a sense, discounting it. I think you get on with the foreign policy, and what Mark said about the special relationship is absolutely right. It's an iceberg. There's something that's visible on top, and normally it's a good relationship between the President and the Prime Minister, the two heads of government, and you have this great, enormous activity that goes on, which is largely unseen. That goes on now anyway. Could it, if we had a long, prolonged, period of really frosty relations at the top, would that affect the relationship down below? Yes, I think, it would. I don't think that's the situation we're in, but we need to be careful.
But however insubstantial maybe these tweets should be seen, is it correct that despite the controversy that President Trump is creating by retweeting things like the Britain First video, true or not, as his spokeswoman said, should he be still extended the courtesy of a state visit here? Is that really the right approach? When the public look at that, they might not understand all the realpolitik about it. Right. Here's a man who's done that, and now he's going to come here and ride in the coach down the Mall.
Well, look, I think that the invitation has been extended. It may be a bit of an albatross, but it has been extended. I think that it's a very serious act then to remove it. It is an act of state, and it's very personal. I think you don't. That's something you don't do.
He might find that a bit irritating.
I think it might give us a very nice catharsis, but I don't actually think it's a sensible act of state. The whole question of when he comes, how he comes, in what sort of circumstances, it does come up in the context of Prince Harry's wedding. Mm-hmm. So this is probably an issue anyway, even if Prime Minister hadn't invited him.
Thank you, Baroness. Ms. Mosbacher, could I bring you in? Could I ask a relatively straightforward question? Can you understand how the shock here that the President of the United States has retweeted a far-right organisation? The White House official spokeswoman has said it's not the point about whether these videos are true or not. Can you understand that on this side of the Atlantic there is total shock and a high degree of anger and, frankly, disgust about what the President has tweeted?
The President's tweets are strategic, and what he's basically saying is, Theresa May, you've got a problem. According to 2011 census, you've got over 2,660,000 Muslims in the UK. You have had unprecedented level of terrorist attacks under Theresa May's watch. Kirchhoff, one of your leading terrorist experts, has stated that over 47,000 Muslim extremists have been identified. What the president's trying to do is to elevate this problem into an international discussion. Theresa May and the UK are like family. So what's happening here in a way is sort of a sibling rivalry. But it has succeeded in elevating an international conversation. And we are America first, but not America alone.
Now, those numbers will be disputed. Some of the points you've made about Muslim communities here and their connection to terrorism will be absolutely disputed. But whatever the arguments about that, is Twitter really the right way to communicate for these delicate and serious issues? Couldn't the president simply have picked up the phone and spoken to the Prime Minister about his concerns, rather than this approach that critics have said is so incendiary?
He's not politically correct, and he's a businessman, and he is hoping to come from a position of strength to protect American borders, especially in the fact that we cannot vet certain individuals coming from 5 countries that are hotbeds for terrorism. And simply that is a problem in the UK. From what I understand, you're bringing in Syrian refugees seeking asylum. They cannot possibly have been vetted thoroughly. And the problem that is originating in the UK with terrorism is something that does concern the United States, especially in terms of protecting Americans. And that is why he is including Americans in this conversation and the general public worldwide. Instead of appeasing enemies or not getting into a discussion, he welcomes it. And I want to bring up, you referenced Churchill earlier. Remember, President Obama stored the bust of Churchill in some dark closet, and the first thing President Trump did was to bring this bust out and display it prominently in the White House.
Yeah.
That's
Thank you very much.
a signal that we do want to work together with the UK.
Ms. Mosbacher, thank you so much for your time, and Baroness Neville.